So I will welcome you to the Tuesday, August 26, 2008 meeting of the Joint Glendale City Council, Glendale Redevelopment Agency, and Glendale Housing Authority. Mr. City Clerk, if you could call the roll for council.
Council members Najarian.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Yusefian.
Here.
Mayor Draymond.
Here.
And the roll for the agency, please.
Agency members Draymond.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Yusefian.
Here.
Chairman Najarian.
Here. For the agency, please.
For the authority.
Authority.
Authority members Draymond.
Here.
Mincy.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Barazian.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Chairman Yusefian.
Here.
Thank you. Mr. City Clerk, could you give us your report, please?
The agenda for the August 26, 2008 joint public meeting of the Glendale City Council, the Glendale Redevelopment Agency, and the Glendale Housing Authority was posted on Thursday, August 21, 2008 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Okay, thank you. And could we hear the item at 1, please?
One is Director of Community Development and Housing, continued from August 19, 2008, regarding discussion of inclusionary housing in lieu fee update for San Fernando Road Corridor Redevelopment Project area. At 1A is a council resolution readopting and amending the inclusionary housing in lieu fee. At B is council motion granting a waiver reduction of the in lieu fee for project at 1838 South Brand Boulevard. At C is council motion directing staff to return with general policy options regarding waivers, reductions, and/or deferrals of in lieu fee for ownership housing. At D is agency motion directing staff to return with general policy options regarding waiver, reductions, and/or deferrals of the in lieu fee for ownership housing. And at E, authority motion directing staff to return with general policy options regarding waivers, reductions, and/or deferrals of the in lieu fee for ownership housing.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kasaki. And let me just, for housekeeping purposes, items 1A, B, and C are all council items. D is an agency item, and E is an housing authority item.
That's correct.
All right. I have a number of cards, but before we go to that, or my colleagues, do we need a refresher? Ms. Blake?
Well, Mr. Mayor, members of council, agency, and authority, I'll give a brief update. Last week, staff provided the updated economic analysis for the current housing market for the San Fernando Road redevelopment project area that was conducted by Kaiser Marston, and the study did conclude that the calculated in lieu fee had decreased 7.5% for ownership and 10% for rental housing, and that according to the Real Estate Research Council for LA County, the new home prices had decreased by 18%. They further concluded that ownership projects generally are not economically feasible with or without the in lieu fee, and that rental projects are feasible and can support the fee, not to say that they're not some financial impacts to rental projects in general because of the market. Staff presented 8 options. Option 8 was the option that we actually brought in, and that was the option that considered a fee deferral, and that was the option that was discussed the most by the council. Generally, the idea was that the fee would be deferred until C of O or completion of the project, and that it would apply to ownership projects, and then based on a determined absorption period, which would be determined by the council, the fee actually would be rebated to the developer based on the pro rata share based on the sales of the units. And this would be predicated on an economic analysis of the housing market at the time. There were a number of issues that had to be fleshed out in that option. We had just walked it in, but there seemed to be general interest. And at the same time, the developer of 1838 South Brand had requested a waiver. The building permit expires August 31st for that project, and that developer had requested a waiver, and so council directed staff to meet with the developer to discuss this specific option to see if we could flesh out some of the issues and see if it would work. We did. Mr. Garcia and Kathy Head and I met with the developer, and we started discussing some of the issues with regard to what type of absorption period, economic analysis, whether it would be local or L.A. County, and actually, Ms. Head offered the idea that if the project were built today, potentially, it could be assumed that the fee would be waived, assuming that the developer developed the project now, and then we talked a little about the absorption period. But at the end of the meeting, the developer concluded that there really were no scenarios under which he would be able to pay the fee or provide a letter of credit, either now or at completion or C of O. And so at this point, City Attorney has prepared a motion for consideration granting a waiver, and also other motions directing staff to come back where we can discuss the policy issue of the in lieu. I mean, we can do it now, but we could come back and have the policy issue in more detail. But this particular project is under a tight timeline.
Mr. City Manager.
Yes, we should point out that the motion that's been provided is representative of the developer, Dr. K's request. It is not representative of staff's recommendation. Indeed, we couldn't come to an agreement the staff could support that would be along the lines within the constraints of the option 8, which was your direction to us.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Ms. Blake. All right, let me go to my colleagues and see if there's any input or comment or questions before we go to the public.
That motion is B?
Yes.
1B.
It would be 1A and 1B would have to be approved to grant the waiver.
Were there any other questions or comments?
Why does 1A has to be approved? It's to readopt
Sure.
the inclusionary housing in lieu fee.
Councilmember,
Why can't that come back if we want to modify the number?
right. Councilman Yusefian, what 1A does, it's a resolution to essentially modify the existing policy. Right now, the policy requires the fee to be paid at the time of building permit. This amends that resolution, and then what 1B would do was grant the individual waiver. So basically, 1A creates a process to grant waivers, and 1B would grant the waiver in this individual case.
Okay. Thank
Any
you.
other comments or questions? Hearing none, we'll go to the public then. Our first speaker is Herbert Milano, followed by Dr. Karabanukian.
Good afternoon. My name is Herbert Milano, Mayor Draymond, members of the City Council. I'm oftentimes puzzled by the way the city policies are developed, especially when I happen to read the objectives of a particular policy and why it is carried forward. I remember when we did not have inclusionary housing and when we were discussing it during the multifamily housing committee. And at that time, I remember Ms. Madeleine Blake, recommending that we support it, and she, we had some explanations of the purpose of inclusionary housing. And then the City Council eventually moved in that direction. So now, instead of inclusionary housing, it is my understanding, if I'm correct, that if the developer does not create that, then they pay an in lieu fee, which I'm assuming then, in turn, gets used for, eventually, for some type of low-income housing. And that is the objective. And so I don't understand the logic of them doing away with the in lieu fee if the original objective was to create low-income housing in the first place. Now, we already have a fairly significant problem with regard to the type of funding and the actual cost per square foot of these projects. The cost per square foot of these projects far exceed anything that you can get on the market today. Today, you can buy an 8-10-unit apartment building, land and building together for less than $300 a square foot. Think about that before you go and proceed within this particular direction. If we're really concerned about the taxpayers' money and the way we invest it, should we then look for then alternatives if these things do not pencil out? This money comes from the federal government. The federal government is a huge, huge deficit. We're borrowing money from China. So in a way, you can say that we are borrowing money so that we can pay for this particular type of housing at a very significant cost per square foot. And on top of that, we're now asking for the in lieu fees that we will use for low-income housing to be modified in some way that would benefit the builder. I don't understand this process. And I wish that the City Council and maybe Housing can explain this to me, because it absolutely doesn't make any sense to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Milano. Dr. Karamanukian, followed by Rodney Kahn.
Mr. Mayor, council member, attorneys, city manager, I don't think I have too much to...
Dr. Karamanukian, could you state your name for the record, please?
My name is Karamanugian. I live in 2226 Hollister Terrace in Glendale. We met with Ms. Block and we discussed with the bank, a lot of issues to start this project. And I think if we come to the decision to waive the in lieu fee, I think I can convince the bank for financing. With my credit with this bank, I don't think if I go to any other banks, maybe they don't give credit. It's very tight. It's very difficult. If the city wants this project to be, and we discuss it, we can start as soon as I can. We are ready. We can put agreement with the city attorney and start the project after, as you know, we need extension, a small extension because the expire of the permit timing. I appreciate your effort. I think each one of you put a lot of time on this at this time, and I appreciate if you come to the right decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karamanukian. Our next speaker is Rodney Kahn, followed by Murad Topalian.
Good afternoon, Mayor, City Council members, City staff. My name is Rodney Kahn. I'm here today on behalf of Dr. Karamanukian. At your last hearing, you guys gave us direction to meet with City staff. I think Ms. Blake already highlighted that meeting. There were a couple other items that did come about during our discussion that I'd like to talk about. One is Dr. Karamanukian talked about getting in touch with lending institutions, because to simply get the project approved and not have it financed and built does not achieve any objective, whether for the city or for Dr. K. During our discussion, we talked about there were some different alternatives, everything from ownership housing to being exempted if it was built within a certain time frame, if it was sold as ownership housing within a different time frame as well. Those were some items that were discussed. Other items that were discussed that was outside of that had not been brought up before, were the economic benefits that new construction in a redevelopment project area generates. Whether there's a fee or not a fee, the tax increment for a project, and how that is looked at and viewed, both from an affordable housing point of view, a parks point of view, or any other positive benefit to the city if the project is constructed. Obviously, if the project is not constructed, those benefits don't exist. Dr. K, we talked over the weekend, we talked on Monday, we talked today before this hearing, trying to come up with some different alternatives that we could look at that he could use, that he could actually build this project. Because, as he mentioned, they're at the point right now where they could pull the building permit, start the construction within the next few months, and actually get some ownership housing, market rate housing, built in this corridor, which we have none of, which I think is a huge, huge asset. Anything that we can do to encourage that, I said that last week, I would hope that you would want to do. I think it's important, too, that we focus that this is an ownership project. This is something that can be constructed, would be constructed, if it was all possible to waive this fee. Anyway, I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Kahn. Murad Topalian, followed by Drew Colquitt.
Mr. Mayor, members of council and staff, my name is Murad Topalian. Rodney has covered the issue rather well. My main concern as a resident of Glendale is maybe it's because I come from the East Coast and I grew up in a city in the East Coast, and we had a habit of building low-income housing all together in one area that we were trying to rehab. And over time, it always backfired. It always backfired because of an economic downturn, people in low-income housing or of low income have a harder time. There's other things that happen when you're having hard economic times, besides the things Mr. Milano put on the board about credit cards and repossessions and everything like that. I don't want to see a area where we or you have already approved 250 units of low-income housing and no building of market-rate housing. I just don't want to see that in the city that I'm living in now. I've had a bad experience with it. I think professionally, if you really look at it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And if we can help someone who is willing to take a risk, if I'm not mistaken, the staff said that even with or without fees, it doesn't make sense right now, economic feasibility, to build owner housing. Am I correct, ma'am? And here you have a guy that's willing to put his own money on the line, take that kind of risk, and balance an area. I think it's healthy for the city, and I would like to see the council consider it in whatever kind of compromise you can come to, but to help this individual out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Topalian. Drew Colquitt, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but if I'm not, I'm hoping you'll correct me.
Very close, Mr. Mayor. My name is Drew Colquitt. My address is 2040 Main Street, Suite 235, Irvine, California. I represent Alliance Residential Company. We're the fourth largest multifamily, fully integrated multifamily mixed-use developer in the United States. We're the owner of 2.5 acres located within the San Fernando Road redevelopment corridor. The address is 526 West Colorado. It's just west of downtown Glendale on Colorado, where the I-5 off-ramp intersects with Colorado. We've been working on a beautiful pedestrian-oriented mixed-use redevelopment for the site within the city with city staff for just over 2 years. The proposed redevelopment is about to be permit-ready. We thank city staff for their considerable efforts and over the last 2 years helping us figure out how to get this project over the goal line. The proposed development includes high-quality retail space and luxury rental residences. The apartments include granite, marble, hardwood floors, etc. The quality and amenities proposed are designed to compete with the Americana, the residences of the Americana. To my knowledge, will be the second institutional quality mixed-use development over $70 million to be developed in Glendale's urban core or near the urban core in the last decade. I'm here to articulate some of the challenges we are having today as we attempt to break ground over the next 60 days. As I said earlier, we are effectively permit ready, or at the goal line, so to speak. We were in the audience last week at last week's meeting on this topic, the fee waiver, fee relief discussions. I felt there was a need to clarify a few things in last week's hearing, but I was not able to speak because I arrived a little bit late due to traffic and my speaker card wasn't accepted for procedural reasons, which I understand. After being here last week and listening to the presentation and speaking with staff this week, we felt that it was very important that we communicate and clarify a few concerns. Primarily in last week's meeting, several statements were made confirming the feasibility of rental housing versus for-sale housing. Our proposed redevelopment includes rental housing. Although I absolutely agree that for-sale condominium projects are extremely challenging today, all product types have been hit hard by the current challenges in the capital markets, and particularly projects proposed in redevelopment areas. Locations where sponsors need a vision to see what could be, and also particularly challenged. Those types of projects like ours are particularly challenging these days because, frankly, bankers, which in the past were willing to pretend like they had a vision, don't really have a vision today, so to speak. They're less likely to positively underwrite redevelopment projects today, and that's happening to us a little bit right now. The point I'm making is that rental housing, hotels, office, retail, and industrial are all also having tremendous challenges with development financing today. Few projects of any type are able to attain debt and equity to break ground. We started work on our proposed redevelopment 2.5 years ago. The permitting and approvals processes have taken 2 years. Is that a time limit for me?
It is. So if you could conclude.
Sure. The point I'm trying to make is we are literally within 60 days of being able to break ground. The problem we've had is we've taken our project to 7 construction lenders. We already own the land. We're at the goal line. This is when you get your construction financing. And although we've built 12 projects in Southern California in the last 4 years, we've never taken one of those projects to more than 2 lenders. This project we've taken to 7, and we've been turned down by 5. We're in negotiations with 2 right now, and there is a gap that we are struggling with. Point is where I do agree absolutely with the esteemed doctor that condominium projects are very difficult today. Our project's also challenged, and even a little bit of help, deferment of timing of paying the fees can be a big deal. We pay $5 million in fees with our project when we break ground. So, just wanted to start that conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Colquitt, and I'm sorry we couldn't take your cards.
No problem.
Last week it was, we were running up against the clock on the overall meeting. I'm sorry. All right, that was the last of the speaker cards. I'll close oral communications, or the oral comment period. Let me return now to my colleagues, see where we are. I will start at this end. Mr. Mincy.
I have no comment. This is a council vote, and I see both sides. It's a real problem financially right now. The economics are slow. I do agree as far as the down in south part of the town, having a non-low-income project, a market rate project, would certainly be advantageous. But I'm going to let you fellas talk about how you're going to vote.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mincy. Mr. Yusefian.
Could we go on? I'm doing some calculations.
Okay. Mr. Najarian.
I would like to, I know there's several motions before us, but I would like to solely stick with the issue that Dr. Karmanukian is presenting and not deal with an overall new policy discussion or new policy formation for the in lieu housing fee. And I'll restrict my comments to that. The first question that we have to get past is whether this project or any other project asking for relief is designed as a condominium or a rental. The reason that's important is because our economists have told us that these projects with the in lieu fee being paid are feasible as rental projects. The economist has said with a condominium project, however, there's problems in getting it done. So the first question that I think was discussed after our last meeting is whether this particular project on South Brand would be dedicated as a condominium project, a for sale project. I understand that there could not be any commitment to that regard, that it would definitely be a for sale project. I really can't, I don't think it's fair to start making any concessions if this would in fact be a rental project, because we just heard from the Alliance people. They would also like relief. I presume that Equity Residential, who also has rental projects, a rental project, would ask for relief also. I'm going to dust off an old idea that I had discussed with the owners months ago, which actually was the genesis of them doing their pro forma, and that was to assume that this is going to be a for sale project. In a for sale project, 15% of the units is approximately 7 units. Were they to include low-income units in the building, there would be approximately 7 units. The relief that I would offer would be to earmark those units as workforce housing units for teachers, let's say. Cerritos School is just down the street. There's another school just on the other side of Adams Square. There's Glendale Community College on Garfield in the area. And for those 7 units that Dr. K, or whoever the owner would be to subsidize the down payment by 50%. Example being, if the market price of the condominium is $400,000, typically someone who wants to purchase would have to put 20% down. That's $80,000. I would request that the owner subsidize that or take a second deed back in the amount of half of that. In this example, it's $40,000. What that would do is it would provide housing for our workforce that sometimes gets caught in the middle. They're not qualified, they're overqualified for the low-income housing. They can't buy the market, and 7 units would be available in this project. This would be a very limited financial commitment by Dr. K, certainly much less than what the full in lieu fees would be. In lieu fees close to $1 million. Under this scenario, about $260,000, $270,000, which would be, of course, paid as those projects were absorbed as workforce housing. That's the only other alternative I can propose, other than the number 8, which we already put forth last week, which did not gain much traction in our after authority meetings with staff. But I really like the workforce housing. I know that the teachers are very excited about it. I think it would hopefully be enough of a reduction that would make the project feasible, and it would put some great deserving homeowners, giving them a chance for their first time in a part of town.
Yes, Mr. Strawberry.
Well, just a question that your concept raises. It implies sale of the units.
It would imply sale of the units.
And one of the basic economic difficulties is that even in the 2-year time frame that the staff spoke with Dr. K and his advisors about, there wasn't a willingness to commit to sell units within that time frame. Now, I think there was a willingness to say eventually, when it makes sense in the marketplace, there'd be a sale, but no time frame commitment. I think the observation was made at the meeting could be 5 years, could be as much as 10 years, depending on what happens in the for sale market. So the whole issue of timing is there, because I think your idea anticipates a sale, and timing a sale is problematic.
Well, my idea does presume sale.
May I clarify just one thing, Mr. Najarian? Your preference is to limit the discussions and consideration to this specific project. At least that's your desire.
I do, and the only reason being that the discussion of I'm willing to discuss that issue at the appropriate, the larger issue at the appropriate time, but I think there's a lot of information that we need to go through, and I'm not sure it's going to be feasible, but of course that's up to my colleagues and you as to how broad the question will be put before us.
I will also ask my colleagues as they give their comments or ask their questions if I can find out what their preference is on that same topic as well. Mr. Quintero.
Okay. When we first started discussing this issue, meaning a few years ago, I felt from the very beginning that it was too early in the cycle. We were about to saddle private development, market rate development, in a zone that is absolutely not desirable at this point in time. I mean, I was there yesterday driving around, and it's strictly industrial. We also have our homeless shelter in that vicinity. There's a lot of a lot of empty properties. So from the very beginning, even though we were in the up cycle in terms of real estate, I just thought it was too early in the game to do that. We needed to wait until at least 2 or 3 projects were built. 2 or 3 market rate projects I thought would provide some incentive, would kind of let people, investors, visualize what was possible there. However, that didn't work, and we came up with the fees, which were moderated from the original concepts. But it's obvious in this economic climate that we're not going to get anything built in the next few years. We're not going to get any private sector market rate housing built around the transportation center and the general part of town where we're all interested in building units. Let me just repeat, I'm interested in that section of San Fernando Road, not necessarily in the rest of San Fernando Road. But I just don't think we're going to get anything built if we don't modify our approach. And we will, if a market rate project is built, we will receive the tax increment from that project. We will receive the park fees from that project, which means that we are going to be able to green that immediate area or the surrounding neighborhoods around this project. Now, in terms of the suggestion of providing market rate housing, I think that's a great idea, specifically for teachers. I've actually spoken to the Teachers Association. I think that's an excellent idea, and maybe we can compromise with that type of provision for this particular project. Then overall, I do think we need to take a look at the policy, so I am into discussing it. And one of the things that comes to mind right off the bat is if there's going to be fees paid, let the developers pay it at the end. But I just don't think we're there yet. I mean, I think a few projects have to be built before it's going to be economically, without fees, before it's going to be economically feasible. That's my feeling.
And Mr. Quintero, on the issue of whether or not we should be considering this globally, then I assume your take is yes, we should, rather than just this project.
Right.
Let me go back to, we skipped over Councilmember Yusefian, who was doing some contemplations at the moment, computations, I should say. We'll come back to Mr. Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was doing a few number crunching. As you know, Mr. Mayor, we passed an ordinance a few months back that said about 75% of the fees, the tax increments from Redevelopment Agency on residential goes into a park fee. 25% for commercial, 75% for parks. So I did a quick calculation based on the staff reports. Mr. Manukian's project is a valuation of $24 million. So after he builds that project, it's going to be worth $24 million. I am figuring it out very simply and discounting it a lot. I am taking only 1%. Actually, the property tax is 1.3 some odd percent. So I'm figuring out that 3% is going to be used to give some to the school district and this and that and so on and so forth. That's $240,000 a year. I'm taking the $440,000 and throwing that out. So I'm just calculating $200,000. $200,000, there's 28 years left to the Redevelopment Agency. It will basically say bye-bye to us by year 2035. It's 2008, so there is your 27 or 28 years left. At $200,000, that's a $5.6 million. So that project will generate about a $5.6 million set-aside money. Let's discount that to $5 million. So I take another $600,000, throw it out. $5 million it generates. 20% of that $5 million is going to be set aside for housing, which means that project, doing nothing, not paying any in lieu fees, nothing at all, generates $1 million for housing, affordable housing, which leaves about $4 million on the bottom of the kitty, which out of that, $3 million is going to be used for parks. And the other $1 million goes to the Redevelopment Agency, could be used for other redevelopment projects in that area. So we're sitting in here and we're going, okay, do we build this project? And I want you to put your hat on. Somebody's going to come to you and say, okay, do you want $1 million now, or do you want $5 million later? Which one would you take? And that's where I come down to. He can leave the building as is, build absolutely nothing, and we get nothing, zero, not even 1 cent. Or we could entice development and end up collecting $3 million for the parks, $1 million for the housing, which that's what we're asking for anyway. It's just you don't get it tomorrow, you get it over time. I did a quick calculation for the gentleman who was talking about the $70 million. That number comes to $18.2 million over 27, 28 years. 3.6 million of that goes for housing, which is 20%. $11 million goes to parks. Now, if we want parks, if we want more money for some of these things, I tend to agree with Mr. Quintero. You need to entice several developments in the area. I hate to say this, they're going to be the guinea pigs. They're the ones who are going to take the risk, build the building, and everybody else is going to sit back and watch. If they sell, that's a good idea. Everybody will be jumping in, which at that point, we don't have to do anything. We just collect the money. If it doesn't sell, guess what? They took a bath. We may lose $1 million. They lose $24 million. And that's where I come down to is, what is it philosophically we want to do? Do we want to encourage more high-end, good quality housing? Or we just don't want to do anything, we just sit here and wait for another 4 years or 5 years, because it will take another 5 years before this market comes back. Which means this agency area loses that 5-year ability to collect those tax increments. And on the Colorado, that's $700,000 a year. In the San Fernando project, will be $240,000 a year. And that's where it kind of boils down to. What do we do? Do we do it? We don't do it? And I tend to think, in this economy, you need to allow some people to take the first step and try something and see how it works. I also think, I like that idea, but I want it vetted out a little bit more so we can understand how much money he has to put out. The other option to the number 8 would have been is that, he pays us 3 years after it's completed. It gives him plenty of time to sell, and that will be 5 years from now. Unless economically we're so far off that we're going to be so bad in 5 years. If this recession goes all the way till 5 years, hey, forget it, It's time for us to do something else. The problem is bigger than we thought it would be. So that's where I come. I think we need to look at other things. We need to look at the millions of dollars that projects all by themselves generate for the area and for the parks that we wanted so bad. Because no project, no money, no park fees, no any other fees. Because what's in there doesn't pay any of those fees right now. Absolutely nothing.
Okay. Mr. City Manager, and then...
Well, Mr. Mayor, just maybe I should have spoken up sooner as Mr. Yusefian went down this avenue. His numbers would generally be applicable if we were talking about the central project area. In San Fernando, it's about a quarter of those figures, because we get about 26 cents on the dollar. Because in San Fernando, because it was a post the AB 1290 project area, we were obligated to do a full statutory pass-through to other taxing jurisdictions. So we don't garner the full dollar like we do in the central project area. Central project area, of course, doesn't carry an in lieu fee requirement. In San Fernando, we get about 26 cents on the dollar. So your numbers relative to what its assessed value would be is probably pretty accurate, but it's about a quarter of what you had arrived at in terms of total value.
Okay, so instead of $11 million, for example, it'll be what?
$2.5 million, $3 million over the 20-year period that you discussed. Yeah, there is much less leverage for us in San Fernando.
How about the set-aside? Would the set-aside be based on
the
full amount?
pass-throughs are post-set-aside, I think.
I think set-asides are before
Set-aside
the
is the full amount.
Right, that,
Yeah.
with the 26 cents is of the gross, and so that assumes we were already setting aside.
So
That's an easy way
that
to
does not
calculate.
include the set-aside.
If you took 26% of your gross
You
number,
get your 20% before the money goes to the other taxing jurisdictions. You get our 26% is also roughly on the gross. It's on roughly the gross tax dollar.
So my 1 million and 3.6 for housing is accurate. It's just the other number for the
The other
park
number's
fee
about a
will be
quarter of it,
lower.
about a quarter of
Okay,
it.
got it. Okay. Quarter, so it'll be 1 million for him for park fee and 3 million for him for park fee. There's a number. That's $4 million.
Ms. Blake?
Mr. Mayor, I just wanted to make a comment on the discussion. We had a fairly extensive discussion this morning with the people from Alliance, Mr. Garcia, Mr. Lanzafame, and I, and they indicated, as Drew indicated, the financing for rental projects is more challenging than it ever has been, and he went in a lot more detail with us about that. But one of the points he made was that they are fully prepared to pay the fee. They in no way were asking for a waiver of the fee. They feel it's in their pro forma, they're fully prepared. They were talking to us about a deferral because they save money during that period. They save the interest during that period, which will help them fill the gap. But they are fully prepared to pay the fee, and I wanted to just clarify that.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Weaver?
Yeah, good arguments made on both sides, and it's not an easy call. As we all know, Dr. Kay's done a lot for this community, but I've heard that different times from other people on other issues. They've done a lot, so we should give back. To me, that's kind of an emotional thing, and we can't consider that here. At least I can't. I remember early on in my council career, a company by the name of Donahue Shriver owned the Galleria, and they looked at 15.5 acres of redevelopment land sitting there, and they proposed a project. Included a master grand hotel fronting on Brand. They went out community-wide and sold the community on it, ready to go. And what happened? The hotel market went south. And Donahue Shriver sold, and ultimately we got the Americana and Brand by Caruso. Market's changed. Now it's the condos that are down. Market's going to come around again. My concern is I'm looking at 4 projects here, and if I'm reading it right, the in lieu fee amounts to about $9 million. If that goes away, because maybe some won't, but I'd be willing to bet most will come in and say they can't make it, subsidize the city, subsidize the whole thing. The taxpayers will spend the $9 million ultimately. And they won't be the last projects. There'll be more that'll come in. When we were looking at condominium conversions, we had to have that gap. If we came in with certain criteria, then you could still convert to condos. If you start down this road of letting one off or 2 off, and all the others are going to follow along and say, what's the difference? I just can't see doing it. Why should the taxpayers have to pick it up? It's just not right, in my view. I can see deferrals. I can live with that, to pay it eventually in some mechanism. I love the design of his project, Dr. Kay's project. I think it'd be great. But if the market isn't there, then maybe it shouldn't be built at this time. I understand the property tax and all that other is going to come down the road. It will regardless. Property values property values have gone down, but they're not going to stay down. Property is the most precious thing we've got. It always increases ultimately in value. So, I think that you have to wait if you can't afford to do it. I can't see letting the taxpayers have to pay this $9 million just on these 4 alone. It's just not the right way to go. So, unfortunately, I just come to the conclusion I can't support the waiver for this. Somehow, it'll have to be paid, and I don't know the mechanism to pay that in, whether it's 2 years, 4 years, 5 years. There's got to be a way, just like Alliance said, they can defer and not have to pay the interest on the money and pay it later. As long as we're getting it, fine. But we're going down a slippery slope when we start letting one person not pay it and then the next one, and then we're having to make a judgment call on every one we do up here. So that's it in a nutshell for me.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Weaver.
Oh, and I don't particularly care to go into the other issues today. I think that's a separate discussion on deferrals and years of payment and so on. I'm just addressing this one concern here today.
All right, and thank you, Mr. Weaver, for the clarification.
No comment. No comment.
Okay. All right. There was a grand discussion going on down here at the tail end of Mr. Weaver's
Discussion during
no, at the tail end of Mr. Weaver's comments. So let me see if
Mr. Mayor,
groundbreaking news is coming forth.
I wanted to understand what Mr. Najarian's concept was. So basically, I think I understand it now. The concept will cost Dr. K about $280,000 that he has to put out of his pocket to basically subsidize those 7 units workforce for their down payment. And he could basically subsidize it for a certain period of time, do a silent second or whatever. And we do the same thing in here. We subsidize. So what I wanted to know is, it's not a bad idea. What do you think about that idea? I mean, creating 7 units for workforce housing.
Again, should I say I'm Karamanugian? I think when we discussed that issue with Mr. Najarian, we didn't have pro forma that we're going to lose $500,000. But even then, I agree that we can do something in that issue, helping the teachers and, but the issue here, we should consider if I can't sell it, I need period of time to rent, then I will sell it. When I sell it unit, I'm ready to pay that amount of the money.
Right, but what he's saying is you will sell, you would automatically get 7, believe me, there will be 7 people who will be willing to buy those units right off the bat because you have 7 buyers due to the fact that you're going to give them a silent second for $40,000. Okay, you got 7 already sold. It's gone.
I agree,
but then you have to sell the rest of them. Now, if we give you 3 years to sell the rest of them, I think what I'm trying to get to, and I think where he is, I don't mind going down this road only if it's for sale. I'm not interested in rentals. So long as you finish the sale in the 3rd year, which is 3rd year after you get your occupancy permit, we like to get that money.
I agree.
After the 3rd year. But you have 3 years to sell. The first 3 months you probably sell the 7 because you are doing that. Is that something that you could live with?
I think so. I think if you give me that 3 years time, and even the economy, if it's bad, if I'm going to lose, I don't have any other reason, I'm going to sell that 7 unit and lose and pay $40,000 from my pocket. But I think I can live with it. I can agree with the approach.
So on the 3rd year, which is 5 years from now.
After occupancy.
Right. I'm assuming 2 years for construction. So on the 3rd year, which will be the 5th year from now,
yes,
if we approve it, we're going to come, knock at your house, you know where you live, and we're going to say, pay up. And whether you sold it or not, you're going to pay.
I agree.
That's agreed.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Starber.
Once again, before we get too far down this road, I think there may be some complexities here that maybe Dr. Kay isn't fully aware of, and you may need to be aware of, for example.
Getting a loan when it's on a
Right.
purchase of a unit.
So,
when
for
there's-
example, you're selling 7, but you're keeping 41 of them as rentals.
Most
Whether a
lenders.
bank will finance something like that, is he going to have to put a map on them and have them all be condominiums, in which case he may be obligated to make
pay all the
HOA fees
HOA
on
fees.
41 units for the next 3 years? I don't know if you've thought through all those details before you wrap up this kind of a structure. I think it's more complicated than just rent 41 for 3 years, but sell 7 of them now. That may be more complicated than that.
And I agree with Mr. Starbird, I didn't thought about that, the financing. I agree with the principle, I agree, but if that's going to stop me to get the loan, that I can't. We need to have, maybe city attorney, they can find a way. Principally I agree, but I think I can't get the loan if I put any condition like that to the bank.
Now, let me, if I can, let me suggest, for example, if you've gotten to the point that 3 years to get them all sold becomes acceptable, then if he commits his money to the 7 for teachers, I'm not sure if it makes a big difference whether it's being sold up front or 3 years, or he's committed to sell them all within 3 years after the certificate of occupancy, and makes then 7 of them available through some structure to workforce housing and some commitment. I mean, that may be something that you can put together in a way that isn't going to be so complicated that somebody then won't be able to get financing on the 7 units. Because at that point in time, if he's willing to say, I will sell them all within 3 years of certificate of occupancy, and oh, by the way, I will make X dollars available for silent seconds or some other structure to underwrite 7 of them for workforce housing as defined, then that's probably a far simpler way to go than to try and have a rental for some period and sale up front, if you've kind of gotten there.
That'll work for you?
Right, I have a couple of questions, but I think part of it's been answered, Dr. Karmanukian. So you are willing to consider some sort of deferment or reduction or something rather than just, a waiver, complete waiver and no deferment?
Well, if I have a time, as mentioned, if it's from now to 5 years, there is a lot of time that I can take a risk more than that I'm taking now, but I need the agreement doesn't jeopardize my loans or other things. If it jeopardizes, automatically I can't. For that reason, I have a couple difficulties here. First, I have the permit going to expire after 10 days. Second thing, to raise the money which for pay the plan permit fee. I don't want to pay all that fee and I don't have the agreement that I can get the money from the bank. I don't need any condition. That's the reason I said waive, because the bank is so tight. That's main thing, that not financing anything. If this condition, like another 280,000 within 5 years, I can think about it. I can take another risk on it, but it shouldn't jeopardize the paperwork. It should be some way that the bank can give me money, but I don't know, as Mr. Starbuck said, he's right. Is the bank going to give the financing? I don't think so. And for that reason, it's, but on the principle, I agree. We discussed it, before the pro forma, I said that, I decided that, but after pro forma, it was a lot of negative. But if I have a window, 5 years, that means within 5 years, we'll see what happens. But I don't want to jeopardize my loan, because without it, why we're going to go all this problem? We can't.
Okay. Thank you. My concern, Mr. City Manager, it was the same. I don't know what it is today, but it used to be with most condominium projects, if the composition of the total renters represented more than 40%, many lenders would not lend. I don't know what that is today. That's how it used to be, in any case. So that was a concern of mine.
Certainly at a 7 out of 48 would raise a lot of concern.
Yeah. And if we're using that as the first threshold for getting into some kind of deferred arrangement, we could be sitting there a very long time. before anyone secures a loan for the workforce housing. What it really boils down to is Dr. Kermanukian is saying that even with this kind of scenario, he's not convinced at the moment that he can get financing for this kind of a scenario. So what we're really talking about is trying to craft a policy for this specific project based on something we're not going to be sure of until Dr. Kermanukian goes out and tries to secure lending for a project where 7 units or so would be workforce housing under a scenario that the rest of the in lieu fees would be deferred. Yes, sir.
Although, if we back away from the 7-unit concept and instead get to a point where the council is willing to grant a 3-year deferral of the fee, and then if they're sold in the same way your consultant had committed to, well, we'll assume today that if they're sold within 2 years, we'll assume that within 2 years the same economic picture today is the same. Even though it may change, you'll get a grandfather on that. If you applied that to 3 years, and then if you looked at a way to secure, if he didn't have them sold as for sale within 3 years, you look to some other means to secure the in lieu fee that he would then owe us.
But, Mr. City Manager, when we discussed this issue the last time, this is exactly what was proposed. That there was that the fees in total would be deferred until a later date, 2 or 3 years later, in order to get around that very issue, and that this could be a more global policy for sale housing, and that at the time after 2 to 3 years, let's say 3 years, when it is sold, that at that time the money would then come to the city. That is what was proposed before, but what was stated to us at that time was no.
Well,
so I agree with you. At that time, I would not only like to see the funds then, the in lieu fees then flow to the city, but also the workforce housing then be kicked in at that point, rather than try to create workforce housing while it's probably going to be rented, and it's going to be very tricky, and I don't think that's going to happen, frankly. I don't think they're just going to fund. Yes, Mr.
Well, again, not dealing with the broad policy, just Dr. K's situation.
Well, I should interrupt and say right now, by my count, from my colleagues that have gone on the record, or who would be voting on the council aspect of these items, only 2 marginally are interested in talking about this locally. The rest are interested in speaking globally.
Okay.
So, meaning that this, whatever this is, it would apply to everyone, not just Dr. Kermanukian. So they may change their view on that, but at least as of when we first went around. Let me go to Councilmember Yusefian.
I think there's 2 things. I mean, there's one issue that deals with Dr. Kermanukian, this particular thing, and then there's another one that is a global issue. I'm trying to figure out, deal with them one at a time.
Well, that was exactly.
And
Councilmember Najarian was saying that he wants to deal with this as a specific issue and then come back to the other at a later date.
I don't want to do it in different times. I'm just doing, in my mind, I'm dealing with them separately. You know, I just divided in my brain. I said, okay, you go here, you go in this honeycomb, you go in that honeycomb.
Is that what's up there?
Yeah, a lot of honeycombs, believe me. You don't want to hear the joke about that one, but nevertheless.
Or other barnyard activities.
You know, I heard what the city manager says, and I think there is a lot to that. I think he's figured out a way to do that. What you were saying, Mr. Mayor, is that in a worst-case scenario, he goes to the bank and they tell him no. So the worst-case scenario is it doesn't happen. The project doesn't happen. We have nothing. That's it. I mean, nobody dies. So it's just that we put certain things in motion and we say if A and B and C happens, D will take place. That's all.
That's not what I'm saying. I understand you, but that's not what I'm saying. Yes, in my view, you are correct that if he doesn't get the funding, then the project doesn't happen. What I'm saying is, what I am understanding the suggestion of the city manager, which I think I agree with at this point, is I'm not so concerned what happens if he can't get financing and the project doesn't happen. I'm more concerned when he does get the financing and it does happen. And when it does happen, if it's a rental project or for-rent project, that there is a timeline to this, and that...
It's not a for-rent project. It's a for-sale project, which he has to sell in 3 years.
Fine. The bottom line is, whatever, if he doesn't get his funding, it's not going to matter. My point is, once he gets his funding,
Okay.
whether he has a 3-year timeline or a 2-year timeline, let's say a 3-year timeline,
Okay.
which is exactly what we talked about last time, 2 or 3-year timeline. When that timeline runs, I don't care whether he has rented his units or sold them or whatever, he's going to pay the in lieu fees on the project, because otherwise it is just a rental project.
No.
Nothing to, well,
That happens on the 3rd year.
that's what I'm
In
saying.
my mind, it's happening on the 3rd year. He's not paying any in lieu fee until the 3rd year when he sells it. That's what I was thinking.
That's what I just said.
Oh, okay.
That's exactly what I just said, which is exactly what all of us said last week.
Okay, I just want
So what I'm trying to get across here is that 3 years runs, whether he's renting them at that point, marketing them, whatever, or somewhere in between, at that point, he's paying his in lieu fees at that 3rd year, the end of that 3rd year. And that's what was suggested last week.
Oh, no. May I?
Absolutely.
I hope we haven't just that. What option 8 was, is that he will make and pay the whole $1 million, either form of letter of credit or in some form or fashion, after he gets his certificate of occupancy.
At SIVA.
Where the difference is in here is we're saying that you have 3 years to sell these. If you sell these things after the end of the 3rd year, all that calculation that we talked about with our staff and all the stuff will take place on the 3rd year, and we will say, okay,
yes,
we're going to do this calculation, and you owe us, let's say, $248,554.
That is correct.
That's what he paid.
That was one of the scenarios that was suggested. The other had to do with a letter of credit.
Right.
And the timeline we discussed was started running when he gets his certificate of occupancy.
Right.
That is correct.
Right.
But both of these scenarios were presented last week. We went nowhere with it because the answer was a flat, absolute no.
Well, he didn't understand it. He says he needed to go
Unless
back.
there was a waiver of the fees altogether,
Oh, that's
the
true.
answer was
He
no.
did say that.
So that's why I'm asking. I want to make sure we're all now on the same page. We need to go back to some of our colleagues here because this is evolving or devolving. It's going back to what we were talking about a week ago. And that's fine, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. Let me go to Councilmember Weaver. He has his hand up.
Let me try to understand. 3 years out, that's after 2 years of construction. So we're talking about a housing market 5 years
from now,
from the time he starts. And who knows what the housing market is going to be 5 years from now. One guarantee, there's going to be more people in Southern California moving from the Midwest to the East, so the housing demand will increase. So if I was a betting man, I'd say in 5 years, they'll be sold. Now, if I understand right, what you're saying is he doesn't have to pay now. The 3 years starts afterwards, and as he sells during that 3-year period, that'd be one way, he could pay us the incremental in lieu fee, or wait to the full 3 years and pay the whole thing, because due payable whether they're sold or not at the end of the 3 years, which is 5 years out. If I understand that right. But if he does, when he goes to the bank, does that factor into his loan, knowing that the bank knowing that he is going to have to pay this in lieu fee at least 3 years in the future, if not before? But does that make sense at all?
I understand your question.
It's not going to factor into his construction loan.
That's right.
Not in the construction, right. I understand that. So is that, I mean,
either of
what
those
don't I understand there?
Well, no, I think you understand it. I think that's a question that we haven't addressed yet. Is it something incremental up to 3 years, or is it at 3 years? That's something we can decide, but Mr. City Manager.
Well, Mr. Mayor, maybe incorrectly. I thought where we were, and that doesn't mean it's where we are, but where we started at when we broke last time, was an acknowledgement that if he actually built and sold the units, there was justification to waive his fee. The question was, how much time would you give him to sell them, and how would you secure the payment of the in lieu if he didn't sell them? And there we talked about, is that correct, Mike?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, if they're...
Right. And then we were talking about an LOC as a way that he
That
could...
was rental versus...
That was rental versus housing.
Right.
What I thought I heard here from at least a couple of council members was a willingness to possibly give him more time to sell them, as opposed to just the 2 years that Kathy had proposed in the meeting. Well, maybe it's 3 years, and maybe it's 3 years on top, 3 years after the certificate of occupancy. So let's say within that 5-year period of time, he built them, he put a map on them, and he sold them, regardless of how many he rented in between, but he sold them. At that point in time, based on the conversation last week and of staff with him over the ensuing week, he'd get a waiver of all of his fees. If he sold every one of them, he'd get a waiver of his fees, because he did for sale new housing. He sold them all, he got a waiver of his fees. Then the only question would be, well, how would you make sure he secures the fees if he doesn't sell them in time? And there's where having him post an LOC, if it's secured by this project, starts to be problematic for his financing. A thought I was just going to express, maybe isn't a good one, is you could look for other means to secure that so it doesn't become a burden on the project if Dr. K were willing to do that. He could put up other security. He could secure the payment of those fees in a different fashion so he doesn't necessarily have to get a commitment from the bank to finance that.
That's correct.
Yeah. But a lot of that, all of that assumes, is based on a premise that you all would, one, want to give him a complete waiver of the fee if he sold all the units, and you'd want to give him enough time to build them and have a 3-year cushion in which to either rent them or at least complete their sale.
Mr. Youssef.
But I'm still under the same assumption that, let's say, he did not sell anything until the 4.5 years. He rented them because the economy was bad. On the 4.5 years before the 5th year ends or the 3rd year of that, economy rebounds, as Mr. Weaver says, everybody from Midwest moves in here, and the condo prices go from $400,000 to $650,000, which is very well. Does he still get his waiver?
Well, under the original scenario I discussed and the consultant discussed with him, he would get his waiver. Essentially, we and he both take a roll of the dice. He agrees to go ahead and construct as soon as he can pull his permits.
Okay.
And he has to hope that within 3 years following a certificate of occupancy, the market will rebound enough that he can sell them, because if he can't, he's going to have to pay us the in lieu if they remain rentals after that, say, 3-year period after the certificate of occupancy.
So
if he is able to
forces him to sell it.
Well, you either force him to sell it or he has to pay us the LOC. And that's where the only thought I had was that the LOC could be secured by other means if Dr. K were so inclined to do that, so it doesn't become a burden on the project. Still a burden on him, but not necessarily a burden on the project. Now, I'm not suggesting you do it. That's just, that's where the meeting with staff had begun to go to, and it was a 2-year period of time. Right?
Okay.
Yeah, that is correct. And at the time, we suggested a letter of credit because Kathy had agreed he probably couldn't get a letter of credit on this project. She agreed with him on that. He would have to get a letter of credit.
He'd secure it some other way.
Secured on something else. And at the time we discussed it, he was not willing to do that or was unable to do that. So that's where we were.
Dr. Karamanoukian, did you have a comment? And I know there's a couple of questions for you.
I understood from Mr. Stark, if I sell them that I don't pay anything, is that what you say?
That's it. That's our roll of the dice.
And remember, I'm not suggesting this. It's just where I saw the conversation going to. I wish he'd just pay him now and go build this project. But the concept was he has 2 years. He has 2 years to get them built. Then he has, let's say he does it in that period of time. Then he has 3 years in which to sell all of them. If he doesn't sell them, if they remain rentals, or the proportionate share that remain rentals, he would then have to pay us the in lieu on the proportionate share that remain rentals and are not sold. On the others, he'd get a waiver of the fee, because he built them today and put a map on them.
And the roll of the dice.
I agree.
The roll of the dice is he can't sell them within 5 years.
No, we want to get market housing in.
Right.
So that's the roll. We're giving up the in lieu.
Well, you're also giving up that he...
But anything he doesn't sell, let's say he sold 45, those two, you're paying the $17.
All right.
So
That's fine.
So you have to sell them in 3 years.
In 5 years.
Yeah, I'm not counting construction.
From the
Nobody
5 years.
buys sticks and a concrete pad.
Okay.
All right. I have a question, a clarification from my colleagues. I still need to know because, you know, in case you haven't noticed, while we're all up here speaking, there are various and sundry interested parties in the back that are scratching notes just feverishly back there. So let me again ask you, who is this going to apply to?
For sale housing.
No, I
They
mean,
have to apply to everybody.
Oh, this particular thing, we're talking just about this project right now.
No, I'm
no, I
not
think
going there.
that's a debate, you see.
It's got to
That
go
is
to
a question,
everybody.
and so I want to go around and just find out. Let me start with Mr.
It's got to be fair. If we're going to do it for this project, we're going to have to do it for the others. Everybody's going to be in there propositioning us in some way, shape, or form.
For sale only?
This, whatever mechanism we give Dr. K, we have to give it to the others. That's my view.
Mr. Quintero.
I would want to give these same terms to the next two projects that come before us. The next two for-sale condominium projects in this, not the rest of San Fernando Road, but in this geographic location on San Fernando Road where we built all of those affordable housing units. I would say the next two projects should get the same terms that we're giving this project.
And the third one,
No, that would be it. After three, then you've got, I think, enough synergy with market rate projects that we go back to the old rules.
Well, may I ask
okay,
Mr. Quintero a question?
Sure, absolutely.
Why,
But not rentals, only market rate.
I know, and why only in this area? Why not in the rest of the San Fernando corridor area?
Well, because from the very beginning, I never thought that mixed-use housing in the rest of San Fernando Road made any sense. This is near the transportation center. We've got MTA, Amtrak, Metrolink. We're trying to build that type of housing around the...
So you would say the area you would identify as transit-oriented
Right.
projects
Right.
that are for sale?
Right.
Well, also, how about,
I
let me add to
understand.
that as a reason that this issue of in-lieu fees has absolutely zero to do with why housing hasn't been built in that area until now. I have not seen any quantifiable data that shows that. Because during the height of the market, nothing was being built there. Anyway, that's just my opinion, but anyway.
Totally decimating. And to wait these fees completely. Should I start over?
Yes,
I believe Dr.
just to
K is
torture you, yes, please.
Dr. K is a good guy. I'd like to give him a break, but we're just decimating our in lieu fee program, our affordable housing program. If it's not illegal, if it's not a breach of the letter of the law, certainly the spirit of the law in which there is affordable housing returned to these areas in lieu for the substantial benefits that the city gets from the tax increment, from these other benefits, and I think we're destroying the redevelopment area. I'd like to give a break. Let's give a break to Dr. K solely, but like I said, we've got everyone else lined up. These are big projects, folks. These are millions of dollars, and they're not even asking for a waiver. We're talking about Alliance. They're just saying, let's defer it for a little bit. We're giving them that and more. We're throwing money.
But Alliance is a rental. We're not talking about rentals. We're talking about for sale. Alliance is a rental. We're not going to give Alliance or Equity Residential. Neither one of them are getting it. We may think about deferral for different reasons, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about home ownership, and that's very tough.
But if there's no one else before us for a for-sale project requesting relief, why are we going beyond the specific example that we've been dealing with for the last months for some of us, and extend it to everyone, to the two next lucky two shoppers? If you're in line, you get your fees waived. I just think that's a problem.
And I would just add that it really isn't. I mean, we're saying it's for market rate housing only, but what we're actually also saying, just so we're being right up above board about this, that those lucky 2 or 3 shoppers get to build, quote, in quotes, market rate housing, but we're actually going to let them rent it anyway for a period of time and have the benefit of doing that and still get their fees waived because...
Time out the market.
That's right, to time out the market. I mean, it just, anyway. So, anyone care to take a crack at consolidating this and wrapping it up by, yes?
Again, so our whole interest here is market rate housing. Forget the rentals. I mean, that's what's behind this. We're looking at this.
Because
anybody building a market rate, we'll do this for, because we want market rate housing. But forget the other part.
Mr. Mayor, if I can I just interject? Sorry if this is one more complexity, but it has to do with...
Sorry, we're ruling out any more complexities.
Well, it has to do with one more factor that gets to this issue of whether you do this prescriptively for the next person walking in the door, and that is land value. There's a distinction with Dr. K, and that is he bought his property in 2006 and paid about $120 a square foot. As you recall, some of the affordable projects we purchased right after our rezone in 2006, land was going for about $120 a square foot. That is the base that he is, pardon the phrase, stuck with on this project, and which would frankly beg that he not do for sale housing because his land base is so high. If somebody were to come in today and maybe be the second project but find a piece of property today, they're going to negotiate a price that's in today's market, a value that's less than $120 a square foot. And frankly, they'd also say, and I got to pay these in lieu fees, so the value is really a little bit less than what the market would say it is today. But in 2006, it was a very different market. Just a very different market. That's what might justify doing a single decision here for Dr. Karmanougian that you wouldn't necessarily extend.
Well, and it's a consideration we don't extend to anybody else in the city when they develop projects based on, oh wait, when did you buy your project? Did you overpay for it by today's standards? So we're going to give I just want to be clear where we're going here, and I am fine based on other reasons that I've stated last week. I haven't, I do believe that we need market rate housing in that area. I don't think what Mr. Topalian was saying is true to a degree. I don't think we're going to have a project there if we don't. But I think it makes very good sense to have some market rate housing in this area and to encourage that. However, let's just be clear, as we do that, in my mind anyway, we are not toying with our in lieu program. We are decimating our in lieu program. Maybe we're willing to do that, but I just want to, let's just be clear on what we're doing here. Yes, sir.
Well, let me just say philosophically, I believe in free markets, and to me, an entire society is responsible for affordable housing. And what we've also done as I guess as a nation, because it works across the U.S., we've definitely put the burden on someone building housing to build affordable housing. Do we put that same burden on the BMW dealer, as I've commented to Nick Lamb many times? Do we put that burden on the Mercedes dealer or the Apple store at the Galleria, one of our highest tax money generators? Yeah. No, we don't. We put it specifically on someone whose business is building housing. So I'm just, it's just kind of interesting to me how we've sort of evolved to that. And in fact, we don't have enough affordable housing in this country, and we never will, unless that burden is spread across all business entities, not just those that happen to build housing.
Well,
so philosophical.
That's an interesting spin on modern liberalism, Mr. Quintero. You might, if you hurry, you might be able to get booked for tonight's convention. So, anyway, well, let's see.
Silly season.
Where are we going, gentlemen?
I need to
entertain I will entertain a motion.
Mr. Mayor, I would like to know what would the city attorney craft a motion that Mr. Starbird just talked about and Mr. Karaparanukian agreed. What would that take?
What would the motion be?
Yes.
Essentially, I think it would be recrafting the original motion that was presented, essentially to waive the fee As
Is it 1A? 1A stays as is?
1A stays as is. It would be 1B
Okay.
that would need to be
How
modified.
would 1B, I'll move 1A, and tell me what 1B is going to be.
Okay. 1B would be a motion to waive the fee, subject to a number of conditions. Number one, I guess, would be to waive the fee to require that the project be constructed within a certain time frame. Like 2 years is the period I heard, and for the units to subsequently be sold for within 3 years of receipt of certificate of occupancy. The payment of the in lieu fee would have to be secured at some point at the certificate of occupancy, either by, we discussed a letter of credit that didn't seem acceptable to Dr. Karamanoukian, so some security of some other asset that's acceptable, I would say, to us, and also to us being the city attorney's office, and also I would suggest to Kaiser Marshall Associates, essentially to assure that the asset is sufficient to cover the debt of essentially $1 million. That's at this point, that's the best that we can offer. We would come back. We wouldn't come back with agreement. We prepare an agreement consistent with that motion. And in addition, I think that I would tell you Dr. Karamanoukian was willing to accept a condition on the waiver that he would pull his building permit, obviously before the expiration of the current plan check, whether that's extended by Mr. Tom or not. And I can't speak to that. And then I think the last condition would be that
Start construction within...
start construction within so many days. It's a policy call of the council.
Prevailing wage?
No.
No.
180 days. Gentlemen. We have a motion at 1A. Before we entertain a second, let me just address the issue of the timeline. Can this be put together? Can we put this together before and still have time for this?
I think the security aspect is drafting an agreement that provides the security for the payment of the fee is the most time-consuming item. To get it done before August 31st obviously would be problematic, but my understanding is that also Dr. Karamanoukian needs an extension from the building official in any event to get all the other things he needs to get lined up to pull that permit. So I cannot speak to whether Mr. Tom is willing to grant an extension. All I can tell you is that our timing would have to run concurrently with that.
Right. Well, I inquired, let me, before we address that, Dr. Karamanoukian, you didn't have a chance to address the issue of some other form of security.
Well, I can't put in my other buildings. Since I am building this, there's a lot of asset in this. Let the security be on the building. How am I going to get, you need collateral, you mean?
That's what I was speaking to you.
I can't.
Okay, thank you. I'm not trying to mesmerize my colleagues here. There's no mind reading going on. I'm just watching Dr. Karamanoukian, and he's communicating also through his expressions as to whether or not we may be coming to a consensus here. It doesn't mean that he is. The other issue is the timeline. I asked last week about extending the timeline because we as a council needed time to figure this out. And what kept coming back is it's up to Stuart Tom, and the answer apparently is no. So,
I don't think it's an absolute no from discussions we've had.
What we got back was if there was a resolution, possibly a couple of weeks, but that would be it.
All right. So,
but it sounds like you've hit a roadblock here on the one item.
It seems like we now have the time, but not the money. So, yes, sir.
May I ask if the fees are going to be waived because he's going to sell everything anyway? So why do we need money for?
If he doesn't sell them.
If he doesn't sell.
Well, he's not going to sell any of them?
Well.
So we put a lien against his property. If it's a rental, he owns the building, right? We put a lien against his property.
Let's just say he has a $20 million first out against his $22 million project, and you're standing in line behind.
You're not going to be in position.
But it's a rental. It's a rental.
All right.
And he's generating money. You go after his personal assets.
Not that easy.
All right. Well, I'm going to suggest that, sorry, I'm just waiting. Did you need to, okay. At this point, Mr. Howard, anybody that looks like they have a suggestion, even if they're not talking to me, I'm waiting for it, so I was about to ask
we were discussing the whole
look out
notion
the window
of
and see if
a
anybody
lead.
out on the sidewalk appears to have an answer. So,
I want to ask
again,
a question.
I will entertain a motion, but
I'd like to
can't
ask
make
a question
motion.
from my colleague, Mr. Quintero. Frank, bail me out. What do you think?
Well, I think what Mr. Starbird suggested is certainly a good idea.
Except they want $1 million.
That's the problem. Dr. Cage has indicated he will not secure the waived fees.
Well, maybe we should ask Dr. Karamanukian to clarify that. I thought I heard him say he wouldn't collateralize any of his other properties.
Right.
He also noted earlier that he believed he'd have trouble getting financing if we secured this property. Maybe we need to clarify that to make sure that, because then I heard him in the audience say, I agree.
Can he get a bond?
I'm not, well, these are some questions I think we need to ask him if we're looking to securitize this property for the full amount of the in lieu fees, should it be necessary to collect them. And it may not very well be, as you noted, he may sell all or a portion of the units.
Well, I suggest we come up with what we think we want to do, and then vote on it, and the staff will present it to Dr. Karamanukian, and then we'll have to see whether he accepts or not.
I'm sorry, Mr. Quintero.
That's it.
Mr. City
Well,
Manager.
that's exactly what I was thinking. I was going to suggest the council just come to grips with what you think is a fair proposal, and then Dr. K can decide whether it makes business sense for him to do it or not, and then we can move on at some later point and talk about the broader policy.
All right.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, absolutely.
Understand. We're looking at reducing the in lieu fees in return for getting market housing ultimately.
Yes, within some period of time. And here,
in this
so far,
case,
it's been
we're
defined
talking
as
2
2 years construction, 3 years after
And if
certificate
he
of
sells them
occupancy.
all, we have zero
Exactly.
fees. He
Exactly.
sells none, we get the full amount.
Right, and the question then was, decide how you want that to be secured, so that if he sells none, you have a way to go collect the waived fees that you hadn't yet received.
It really be up to him.
I have to ask my colleagues, is there a, for lack of a better word, a drop-dead deadline to this at some point? In other words, Mr. Weaver, to answer your question another way, there is a third option there. He sold 10 of them and never sells more than 10 of them.
I think it's an incremental, as I said earlier. As he sells the incremental, in lieu fee is eliminated. It's at the end, whatever is left.
So we have to come back to that issue,
So
which is about incremental versus just hand out, pay it all. So that's another...
Just a bookkeeping.
And the drop date, I think, is the third year.
The third
He
year
pulls the
after
certificate of occupancy.
Right. Third year after the pulling of the certificate of occupancy. That's your drop date.
You can have an accounting going all along
My
of the
question is,
incremental.
he sells 4 units. Is it a rental, or is it a...
He's going to have to pay the in lieu fee for the 40, you said 4? 43 of them.
So this is sort of an in lieu fee freeze bell. And 5 years out, freeze bell rings. Whatever you've sold, that's what it is. The rest,
All right.
go.
All right. I think a more likely scenario will be that perhaps he sold 60% of the building or 70% or
Some
whatever.
percentage.
That'll probably be the way the scenario will go.
And the whole reason we're doing this is to get market rate housing. We're getting the fee to get the market rate.
Well,
That's what we're doing.
That's the justification, anyway.
That's the justification on
Okay.
this particular case. No other.
Okay? Would someone like to make a motion?
Already made, okay. I made 1A and the B as was modified.
Do we have a second?
I think the only
Yes,
question is what the security is. Is it just a second on this project, or did you want to have does the council want to have another asset that the city attorney's office and Kaiser Marston deem sufficient to secure the obligation.
I like the second item, which is you figure out what deems to be. You figure out an instrument that you think it's good enough. Because there could be thousands of different ways. You could put up CD zones, or put other, there's a lot of different things. So I'm not going to sit in here and try to figure it out one at a time.
Okay. All right, we have a motion.
I just want to understand what's the difference between A and B. Now, we have to do A first.
That's correct. A just gives you the mechanism to
The
grant
mechanism,
waivers.
the mechanism to do it.
Correct.
Then we can or cannot, then we have the option of doing it or not doing it on B.
Yes.
I'll second it.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there further discussion?
On A. A and B?
A and B. All right. Can we hear the roll call for the council?
Is this A and B together?
It's A and B together. These are council items.
Council members Najarian?
Present.
We're not asking for your mental state.
Stay. Hey, Obama can do it.
Quintero?
Yes. Looks present.
Weaver?
I guess so.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Yusefian?
Aye.
Mayor Draymond?
Yes.
Okay, now what do we do now?
Well, we still need...
Yes, Mr. Garcia.
So to say C, D, and E are just to continue the global discussion to a later time, but you don't actually have to do that. We can just
Our
bring it back.
recommendation would be we come back and have that conversation at a later time.
Okay. Now, is there anything that we get back on this, Mr. Mayor, now? Like, are we going to do
You'll get a report
incremental?
back. You'll get a report back at some point,
Trust
probably
me,
within the
you're
next
going to
2
get some
weeks.
things back on this.
So it's not a done deal yet?
No. There could very well be disagreement over what the city attorney and your consultant feels is adequate security for the in lieu fee waiver, in which case there won't be an agreement.
And how about the incremental and the years? Is that all embedded?
What I took is that's 2 and 3 with the pro rata. So if at the end of 3 years there's 60% sold, he's got to pay us 40% of the fee.
Okay, you're going to do it that way?
Well, that's what I took.
That's what we understood to be the motion.
We need to move on. We still have another meeting after this. By the way.
Move to adjourn for city council.
All right.
Second.
The motion, the second.
Move to adjourn for the Redevelopment Agency.
Second.
Move to adjourn for housing.
Second.
We're